Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the epic 1,200-year history of Rome. But, we're not just going to rattle off a timeline of dusty dates and battles. Instead, we're going to look at this massive, sprawling civilization like it's a living, breathing character. Literally a character, with a completely chaotic birth, a deeply traumatized youth, a massive midlife crisis, and a really slow, exhausting demise. So, how did a scrappy village of runaway criminals manage to conquer 10% of humanity and then lose the whole shebang? Well, let's dive right into this massive question. We're going to trace Rome's geopolitical life cycle from its truly bizarre mythological origins all the way down to its surprisingly anticlimactic end. By the time we wrap up, you'll see exactly how this tiny settlement pulled off world domination and why all that power eventually just slipped right through their fingers.
To make sense of it all, we'll follow this roadmap. First, myths, kings, and kidnappings. 2, the Republic's villain arc. 3, Caesar and the Empire. 4, building the Golden Age. 5, chaos, guards, and crisis. And finally, number 6, the fall of Rome.
All right, let's kick things off with part 1, myths, kings, and kidnappings, the chaotic birth.
So our story actually starts in a city called Alba Longa, with this absolutely wild myth involving a forbidden Vestal virgin, the war god Mars, and a female wolf who somehow ends up raising twin boys. But what's really fascinating here is that the grand, epic founding of Rome was at its core just a petty sibling rivalry. The twins, Romulus and Remus, decided to build a city together, right? But they just couldn't agree on which hill to put it on. The argument escalated so much that Romulus threw a fit and just started building a tiny wall all by himself. Remus, acting like your classic annoying brother, totally mocked him and hopped right over it. Well, Romulus responded by literally killing his brother on the spot. So yeah, the mighty Roman Empire was basically founded on a case of fratricide.
Okay, so Romulus is now king, but his shiny new city is essentially just a homeless camp with a lot of ambition. To actually get people to move there, he declared Rome an asylum city, opening the gates to basically anyone on the run. And the demographics, they were a hilarious disaster. We're talking runaway slaves, debt dodgers, exiles, criminals, guys who stole goats, you name it. It was just this giant crowd of chaotic men, which, as you might guess, immediately presented a massive issue. They had food, they had walls, they had hills, but they had exactly 0 women to start families with.
Now, Rome infamously solved this little gender imbalance by hosting a massive party. They invited their neighbors, the Sabines, and then, well, they just kidnapped all their women. Surprisingly, though, after a brief war, the two groups actually merged. From there, Rome cycled through 7 kings. A few of them were decent, they built sewer systems and temples and stuff, but that 7th and final king, he was so incredibly sinister and cruel that the people actually banded together and completely expelled him. And this moment is absolutely crucial. It birthed a deep-seated institutional paranoia, a literal terror of kings that would define Roman politics for centuries.
Moving on to part 2, the Republic's villain arc, the traumatized youth. So, having sworn off kings forever, the Romans set up a republic and elected 2 consuls instead, who ruled together just to keep each other in check. But then, they faced an event that permanently altered their national psyche.
This right here brilliantly illustrates Rome's villain origin story. See, way before they were this massive global power, Rome actually lost a war to the Gauls. The Gauls just marched right in, burned the city to the ground, and only left after Rome paid them this incredibly humiliating ransom in gold. And the trauma of that event, it completely flipped a switch. To make absolutely sure they would never ever be humiliated like that again, Rome turned hyper-militaristic. First, they conquered their Latin neighbors. Then they subjugated the hill tribes. Next, they absorbed the Greek colonies. Eventually, they clashed with their massive rival Carthage in the Punic Wars, where they defeated Hannibal's famous elephants and literally wiped Carthage off the map. Basically, if it wasn't nailed to the ground, Rome absorbed it.
That brings us to part 3. Caesar and the Empire, the midlife crisis. Flash forward about 330 years, and Rome is totally addicted to expansion, which perfectly sets the stage for the final boss of the Republic, Julius Caesar.
Now, Caesar was this brilliantly effective general. He completely dismantled the Gaul region and then just marched his fiercely loyal army right back into Rome. But, he wasn't purely evil. He actually fixed their chaotic calendar, creating the 365-day system we literally still use today. He lowered taxes, he gave the poor free grain, the common people absolutely loved him. But by making himself dictator for life, Caesar started collecting political offices like trading cards. The Senate looked at this guy and, fueled by that 500-year-old paranoia of kings we talked about earlier, they decided to save the Republic by stabbing him to death in the middle of a meeting.
Yeah, that assassination? It was a colossal blunder. The public was absolutely furious that the Senate killed the guy who, lowered their taxes. This immediately sparked a massive civil war. And out of all this chaos emerged Caesar's 18-year-old adopted heir, Octavian. Octavian totally outmaneuvered his main rival, Mark Antony, who, to be fair, got highly distracted by Cleopatra down in Egypt. So Octavian defeats them, takes sole power, and then does something really clever. He avoids using the title of king. Instead, he calls himself First Citizen, or Imperator, and changes his name to Augustus. And just like that, in 27 BC, the Roman Empire is officially born.
Which leads into Part 4. Building the Golden Age, Wealth and Stability. Augustus knew he had to survive, so he focused on fixing the one fatal flaw that had just torn the Republic apart, the military.
See, Augustus realized that all those past civil wars happened for one simple reason. Soldiers were loyal to the individual generals who paid them rather than to the Roman state itself. To fix this, he created a state-funded professional standing army. We're talking a 20-year enlistment with guaranteed retirement packages. It was a real game changer that created unprecedented stability. Inside the empire, you had this highly structured life. Paved roads, massive aqueducts, written laws, and a systemic stability that could actually absorb huge shocks like a famine. Meanwhile, outside the borders, tribes lived in very flexible, decentralized rural societies. No permanent bureaucracy, no standing armies. This stark contrast made the Roman way of life look so incredibly attractive that tribes outside the borders became absolutely desperate to get in.
But Augustus also had to learn the hard way that expansion eventually has its limits. 20,000. To put that into perspective, that staggering number represents the career Roman soldiers who were completely annihilated in the Teutoburg forest. Basically, a trusted Germanic ally named Arminius, who knew exactly how Roman legions operated, lured the Roman general Varus into a dense forest ambush. The legions were strung out along the muddy paths, totally unable to form up their usual shields and ranks, and they were just systematically slaughtered. This traumatic defeat was a massive wake-up call. It permanently stopped Rome's push into Germania, turning the Rhine River into a hardened defensive border for centuries. Let's turn to Part 5, Chaos, Guards, and Crisis, the Internal Rot.
Now, after Augustus passed, the empire was structurally pretty sound, but the leadership, it began to suffer from some severe internal rot. It started right away with the very next emperor, Tiberius. This guy was an extreme introvert. He hated the public so much that he basically just isolated himself on the island of Capri. But by leaving Rome, Tiberius created a massive, dangerous power vacuum in the capital. And who stepped in? The Praetorian Guard. Originally, Augustus designed them as an elite, personal protective unit. But this heavily armed force, permanently stationed right there in Rome, soon realized something incredibly dangerous. Since the emperor wasn't around, they were the ones controlling access to power. Over time, this got completely out of hand. They started flat out murdering emperors they didn't like Caligula, and installing their own picks, like Claudius. It got so crazy that by the year 193 AD, they literally auctioned off the title of emperor to the highest bidder. And that guy, he lasted a mere 66 days. The big takeaway here is that power no longer flowed through laws or institutions. It flowed entirely through whoever controlled the soldiers closest to the throne.
All this military chaos culminated in the absolutely disastrous 3rd century. We were talking almost weekly emperor assassinations, terrible plagues, and crippling hyperinflation. The empire was quite literally fracturing. To save it, one emperor made a really radical choice. He chopped the empire into 4 distinct administrative pieces, a system called the Tetrarchy. This made sense because it allowed leaders to live much closer to the active, dangerous borders. But it also meant that the city of Rome itself was essentially abandoned as the true center of power. Eventually, Emperor Constantine comes along and reunites the empire, but even he refused to move back to Rome. Instead, he chose to build a rich, brand-new Christian capital way out in the east, naming it Constantinople. Which finally brings us to Part 6, the fall of Rome, the slow demise. Because of that shift east, all the wealth, the trade, and the intellect moved to the Greek-speaking eastern half of the empire. This left the Latin-speaking west behind as this increasingly neglected, decaying shell.
You know, the fatal blow to the Western Roman Empire wasn't some single cinematic, glorious battle. It was actually a tragic chain reaction of uncontrolled migration. So in the late 4th century, the terrifying Huns explode out of the Eurasian steppe, and they push tens of thousands of Goths right up against the Roman border, essentially begging for asylum. Rome actually let them in. But corrupt Roman officials completely mismanaged the entire situation, literally starving and exploiting these refugees. While pushed to the absolute brink, the Goths revolted. They wiped out an entire Roman army and actually killed the emperor at the Battle of Adrianople. Basically, by failing to properly integrate this massive influx of people, Rome had essentially imported a civil war directly inside its own borders.
From there, the dominoes just fell rapidly. Various armed groups were literally handed pieces of Roman land just to stop them from burning things down. The Vandals swept in and took North Africa, which critically cut off Rome's main supply of grain and tax money. And, as we know, without taxes, there are no soldiers. The Visigoths even marched in and sacked the city of Rome, pretty much just because they could. Finally, in 476 AD, the Western Empire truly died of 1,000 cuts. The very last Western emperor was a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, literally carrying the names of both the city's founder and its very first emperor. And he wasn't killed in some grand siege. He was just politely asked to step down by his own Germanic commander. The Western Empire didn't go out with a bang. It just faded away from sheer fatigue.
But here is what you should really take away from all of this. While the city of Rome and the entire western half collapsed, that rich eastern half of the empire, operating out of Constantinople, survived for a staggering 1,000 additional years. Now, modern historians like to call them the Byzantines, but they absolutely consider themselves Romans. They were out there fighting off Persians, Crusaders, and Arabs all the way until 1453. So looking back at this massive, chaotic life cycle we've just unpacked, it leaves us with one final fascinating question to chew on. When half your civilization completely dies, but the other half thrives for another millennium, what truly defines the end of an empire?